In the winter of 1878, deep in Montana Territory's isolated valleys, a traveling physician discovered something that would haunt American folklore forever. Behind rotting cabin walls, beneath loose floorboards, lay evidence of a family's century-long genetic manipulation, a bloodline so twisted that nature itself recoiled in horror. Dr. Theodore Brennan's horse struggled through knee-deep snow as he approached the remote Donnelly homestead in January 1878. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly around him, a white wasteland broken only by skeletal trees and the occasional wisp of chimney smoke. He had been summoned by a desperate letter from Patrick Donnelly, pleading for medical assistance with his wife's difficult pregnancy. The cabin materialized from the storm like something born of nightmares. Its logs were blackened with age and neglect, the windows clouded with grime and ice. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney that seemed to lean away from the structure, as though even it sought escape. The yard was littered with crude crosses, too many for a family of modest size. Brennan dismounted, his medical bag clutched tight against the biting wind. The silence was unnatural, oppressive. No dogs barked, no chickens clucked, no children played. Only the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant howl of wolves echoing across the frozen landscape. Patrick Donnelly answered the door before Brennan could knock, as though he had been watching from the shadows. The man was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets. His clothes hung loose on his frame like burial shrouds. Behind him, deeper in the cabin's gloom, shapes moved without purpose, family members who seemed to drift rather than walk. "Doctor," Patrick whispered, his voice carrying the weight of desperate secrets. "You came." He glanced nervously over his shoulder before stepping aside. "Please, she's been laboring for 3 days." The cabin's interior assaulted Brennan's senses immediately. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. Candles flickered in every corner, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams overhead, crude markings that hurt the eyes to study too closely. In the corner, a woman lay writhing on a straw mattress, her screams muffled by a leather bit between her teeth. But it was not her suffering that froze Brennan's blood. It was the others. Children huddled in the shadows, their faces pale and malformed, eyes too large for their skulls, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. As Brennan stepped deeper into the cabin, the floorboards creaked ominously beneath his feet. One board, near the center of the room, was loose, newer than the others. Patrick's eyes darted to it frantically, then back to the doctor's face. What lay beneath that board would challenge everything Brennan thought he knew about human nature, family bonds, and the depths of depravity that could fester in America's forgotten corners. The Donnelly family secret was about to claw its way into the light. Dr. Brennan knelt beside the laboring woman, but his medical instincts were overwhelmed by the wrongness permeating the cabin. The woman, Moira Donnelly, bore little resemblance to any patient he had treated. Her bone structure was subtly malformed, her jaw protruding at an odd angle, her fingers webbed partially with thin membrane. Most disturbing were her eyes, one blue, one hazel, both staring at him with an intelligence that seemed fractured, as though two different minds peered out from behind them. "How long has your family lived in this valley?" Brennan asked Patrick, trying to maintain his professional composure while examining Moira. Patrick's response was barely audible. "Always. We've always been here." His gaze kept drifting to that loose floorboard. "My grandfather, his grandfather before him, the land, it keeps us." As Brennan worked, he became aware of the children watching from the shadows. They moved with an unsettling synchronicity, tilting their heads at identical angles, breathing in perfect unison. Their resemblance to one another was uncanny, not the normal similarity of siblings, but something deeper, more fundamental. They looked like copies of the same broken template, each bearing the same hollow cheeks, the same too pale skin, the same haunted expression. During a brief respite in Moira's labor, Brennan noticed something that made his hands tremble. Scattered across the cabin's rough table were documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, genealogical charts. But the names repeated in impossible patterns. Patrick Donnelly was listed as both son and husband to women bearing the same surnames. Children were recorded as offspring of their own siblings. The family tree didn't branch. It coiled in on itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. When Moira's screams intensified, Patrick began to pace frantically over that loose board. The wood groaned under his weight, and something beneath shifted audibly. Brennan's medical bag sat nearby, and as he reached for his instruments, his knee pressed against the board. It tilted, revealing a dark space underneath. The smell that rose from that hidden cavity was overwhelming, the sickly sweet stench of decomposition mixed with something else. Something preserved. Patrick lunged forward to press the board back down, but it was too late. Brennan had glimpsed what lay beneath. Small white forms wrapped in rotting cloth, dozens of them arranged in neat rows like some grotesque nursery. "Those are the imperfect ones," Patrick whispered, his voice breaking. "The ones who didn't meet grandfather's standards. We've been improving the leakies, fine for generations." The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Brennan realized he wasn't just delivering a baby, he was witnessing the culmination of a genetic experiment that had been running for over a century, guided by a twisted interpretation of selective breeding that had reduced human beings to livestock. Outside, the wind howled like the voices of the buried children. Patrick's confession spilled out in broken whispers as his wife's labor continued through the night. The Donnelly lineage, he revealed, had been shaped by generations of deliberate inbreeding, overseen by patriarchs who believed they were perfecting their genetic heritage. What began as isolated mountain folk trying to maintain their bloodline had evolved into something monstrous. "My great-grandfather, Seamus, started it," Patrick muttered, his eyes never leaving the loose floorboard. "After the famine in Ireland. He said we couldn't trust outsiders, couldn't let foreign blood weaken us, so he kept it in the family, kept it pure." Dr. Brennan fought revulsion as Patrick described the family's methodology. Children were evaluated at birth according to criteria passed down through generations: the shape of their skulls, the clarity of their eyes, the straightness of their limbs. Those deemed perfect were raised to continue the bloodline. Those found wanting disappeared beneath the cabin floor. The genealogical charts told a horrifying story of systematic genetic manipulation. Fathers had bred with daughters, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces. The family had rationalized each union with twisted logic, preserving their superior traits, maintaining their connection to the land, keeping their secrets safe from the outside world. Moira's current pregnancy was the result of her union with her own father-in-law, old Malachi Donnelly, who still lived deeper in the mountains. Patrick spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and terror. "He's 93 years old and his mind is still sharp as a blade. He says we're close now, close to achieving perfection, just a few more generations of careful breeding." The children clustered around the cabin were living testimony to the experiment's failures. One boy's left arm was withered and twisted. A girl's skull was misshapen, giving her face a collapsed appearance. Another child hadn't spoken a word in his 12 years of life, only stared with eyes that never seemed to blink. "What happens to the perfect ones?" Brennan asked, though he dreaded the answer. Patrick nodded toward the mountain slopes. "They go to grandfather. He keeps them in the upper cabin, teaches them their purpose. The boys learn to select breeding partners. The girls learn obedience." As dawn approached, Moira's labor reached its climax. Her screams echoed through the cabin, mixing with the wind outside to create a symphony of suffering. The birth itself revealed the true horror of the Donnelly experiment. Twins joined at the chest, their shared heart beating visible beneath translucent skin. Patrick looked at the infants with a mixture of hope and dread. "Grandfather will decide if they're perfect enough to live," he whispered, "or if they join the others under the floor." The weight of a century's worth of genetic manipulation pressed down on that small cabin like a physical force, suffocating and inescapable. Old Malachi Donnelly descended from his mountain stronghold like a wrathful god passing judgment on his creation. At 93, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting control over every aspect of life and death in his domain. His eyes, pale blue and unnaturally bright, missed nothing as he examined the conjoined twins his experiment had produced. Dr. Brennan watched in horror as the ancient patriarch handled the newborns with the clinical detachment of a livestock breeder evaluating stock. Malachi's fingers, gnarled but steady, traced the line where the infants' chests fused together, prodding the shared organs visible beneath their paper-thin skin. "Imperfect," he pronounced after several minutes of examination. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "The joining disrupts the bloodline's purity. They cannot breed true." The casual way he delivered this death sentence chilled Brennan's blood. The old man spoke as though discussing crop rotation rather than the fate of human infants. Around the cabin, the deformed children watched with vacant expressions, long since conditioned to accept their grandfather's verdicts without question. Malachi turned his attention to Dr. Brennan, studying him with those unsettling pale eyes. "You've seen our work, outsider. Generations of careful cultivation, of protecting what makes us strong." He gestured to a collection of journals stacked on a shelf, ledgers documenting decades of breeding records, genetic observations, and experimental outcomes. "Your family tree," Brennan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "It's not a tree at all. It's a knot. You've tied the bloodline so tightly it's strangling itself." Malachi's laugh was like the scraping of dry bones. "Weakness speaks of strangulation. We call it concentration. Every generation we distill what is essential, discard what is flawed." He moved to a wooden chest in the corner, retrieving a leather-bound book filled with daguerreotypes, portraits of Donnelly family members spanning 50 years. The photographs revealed the progressive deterioration of the bloodline with shocking clarity. Early images showed relatively normal-looking people, if somewhat isolated in their mountain valley. But as the decades passed, the faces became increasingly malformed, skulls elongated or compressed, eyes positioned asymmetrically, limbs bent at impossible angles. "Each imperfection taught us something," Malachi continued, flipping through the grotesque gallery. "Each failure brought us closer to understanding how to breathe them out." The twins began to weaken in Dr. Brennan's arms, their shared hearts struggling to support both bodies. Malachi watched their decline with satisfaction rather than sorrow. "Nature corrects our mistakes," he said. "These will join their siblings soon enough." Through the cabin's grimy windows, Brennan could see more crosses in the yard, dozens of them, marking the graves of generations of imperfect children who had failed to meet the patriarch's twisted standards. As the conjoined twins fought for life in Dr. Brennan's arms, Malachi Donnelly revealed the full scope of his family's systematic breeding program. What had begun as mountain isolation had evolved into a deliberate genetic experiment spanning 4 generations, guided by a perverted understanding of selective breeding principles and fueled by an obsession with racial purity that bordered on the occult. From his leather satchel, Malachi produced detailed breeding charts that mapped sexual relationships within the family with scientific precision. Each union was documented, analyzed, and rated according to the quality of offspring produced. Women were assigned breeding scores based on their fertility, the health of their children, and their compliance with family protocols. Men were evaluated for their genetic contributions and their ability to maintain discipline within the bloodline. "The outside world grows weak through mixing," Malachi explained, his voice taking on the fervor of a religious zealot. "Irish blood mingles with German, English with French, producing mongrel offspring with no true heritage. We maintain purity, we concentrate strength." The reality was horrifying. Dr. Brennan studied the charts and realized that every person in the cabin was the product of at least 3 generations of incestuous breeding. Patrick was both son and nephew to his father-in-law Malachi. Moira was Patrick's half-sister as well as his wife. The children represented layers of genetic complexity so tangled that determining their exact relationships was nearly impossible. Malachi had kept meticulous records of each pregnancy, documenting birth defects, survival rates, and physical characteristics. Children born with visible deformities were categorized as failed specimens and quietly eliminated. Those who survived childhood were evaluated for breeding potential and assigned partners within the family structure. "The perfect child will emerge eventually," Malachi insisted, his pale eyes gleaming with fanatic certainty. "Each generation brings us closer. The weak die, the strong survive, and from their union comes something greater than human." Dr. Brennan noticed notations in the margins of the breeding charts, references to the doctrine of improvement and the Winter Edict, terms that suggested this wasn't merely one family's madness but part of a larger movement. Malachi spoke of correspondence with like-minded individuals in other isolated communities, exchanges of breeding stock and genetic information. The twins in Brennan's arms grew colder despite his efforts to keep them warm. Their shared circulatory system was failing, their breathing becoming increasingly labored. Malachi watched their decline with clinical interest, occasionally making notes in his current journal. "Document the failure," he instructed Patrick. "Duration of survival, visible defects, probable causes of death. Each data point guides future breeding decisions." The old man's casual discussion of infant mortality as research data revealed the complete dehumanization that had infected the Donnelly bloodline. They no longer saw themselves as people but as specimens in an ongoing experiment. As Dr. Brennan tended to the dying twins, Malachi revealed that Donnelly family's breeding program was not an isolated experiment, but part of a larger, more organized movement. From a hidden compartment in his wooden chest, the patriarch retrieved correspondence from what he called the Society for Improvement, a network of families and individuals across the American frontier who shared his obsession with genetic purity. The letters, written on fine paper bearing elaborate letterheads, came from locations as distant as Pennsylvania, Ohio, and even back to Ireland. They discussed breeding techniques, shared genealogical data, and arranged exchanges of suitable specimens between participating families. The correspondence was written in coded language that made human trafficking sound like academic discourse. "We are not alone in this work," Malachi explained, arranging the letters like a hand of cards. "Across the territories, enlightened families recognize the need to preserve superior bloodlines. We share knowledge, we share resources, and sometimes we share children." One letter, dated just 3 months earlier, discussed the transport of a promising female specimen from a Pennsylvania family to a group in Colorado Territory. Another detailed the medical observations of a doctor in Ohio who had been documenting the results of controlled breeding experiments on what he termed volunteer families. The scope of the network was staggering. Dr. Brennan realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than one family's descent into madness. This was an organized effort to manipulate human genetics on a massive scale, hidden within America's frontier communities where isolation provided perfect cover for monstrous activities. Malachi spoke of the society's ultimate goal, the creation of a purified American race that would combine the strongest traits from carefully selected European bloodlines. The isolated mountain valleys and remote homesteads of the expanding frontier provided perfect laboratories for their experiments, far from the scrutiny of law enforcement or medical authorities. "Each family contributes to the greater understanding," Malachi continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a religious sermon. "The Donnellys perfect the Irish strain. The Kowalskis in Pennsylvania refine the Polish heritage. The Brenners in Ohio concentrate German purity. Together, we will birth a master race worthy of this new continent." The twins' breathing became increasingly shallow as their shared hearts struggled to sustain both bodies. Malachi made notes about their deterioration with scientific detachment, treating their suffering as data points in his grotesque research project. Dr. Brennan felt the weight of the discovery crushing down on him. This wasn't just about one sick family. It was about a coordinated effort to transform human breeding into a systematic horror hidden within the very communities that were supposed to represent America's pioneer spirit and family values. The society's tentacles reached far beyond this remote Montana cabin. Deep in the night, as the conjoined twins grew weaker in Dr. Brennan's arms, Malachi Donnelly spoke of his masterwork, a child he claimed represented the pinnacle of 4 generations of selective breeding, hidden in the upper reaches of the mountain, in a cabin known only to the patriarch himself, lived what he called the perfect child. "She is 17 now," Malachi whispered, his pale eyes gleaming with unholy pride. "Born without flaw, raised in isolation, prepared for her sacred purpose. She carries the concentrated essence of our bloodline, every strength preserved, every weakness bred away." The old man's description painted a picture of deliberate genetic cultivation that had reduced a human being to little more than a breeding specimen. The girl had been separated from the family at birth, raised in complete isolation to prevent any contamination from the failed experiments that populated the Eloa cabin. Her education consisted entirely of learning her role in perpetuating the bloodline and accepting her grandfather's absolute authority over her reproductive future. She speaks only when spoken to, obeys without question, and understands her biological destiny, Malachi continued. Her bone structure is perfect, her organs flawless, her mind shaped to accept guidance. She is what 4 generations of careful cultivation can achieve. Dr. Brennan felt sick listening to the dehumanization of what was essentially a young woman kept in captivity for breeding purposes. The patriarch spoke of her fertility cycles as though discussing livestock, noting that she had been kept in a state of perfect health specifically to maximize her reproductive potential. But there was something else in Malachi's voice, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. "She has begun to resist," he admitted quietly, "questions her confinement, speaks of the world beyond the mountain. These thoughts are contamination, weakness trying to assert itself." The girl's growing rebellion clearly disturbed the patriarch, who had expected complete compliance from his perfect creation. Her developing sense of self-awareness represented a flaw in his system, the emergence of individual will where only obedience should exist. "Soon she must be bred," Malachi continued. "The bloodline cannot afford to lose such perfection to age or accident, but finding a suitable father proves challenging. The males of this generation carry too many visible flaws." The implication was chilling. Dr. Brennan realized that Malachi was considering breeding the girl with himself, or possibly with her own father, Patrick, to maintain what he saw as genetic purity. The society's correspondents had discussed similar arrangements in other families. The twins' shared heartbeat grew fainter, their skin taking on a bluish pallor. They were dying, another failed experiment to be added to Malachi's gruesome records. But here up the mountain, a young woman waited in isolation, unaware that her grandfather was planning to use her body to continue his monstrous legacy. As dawn broke over the Montana peaks, Malachi insisted that Dr. Brennan accompany him to witness his greatest achievement. Despite his horror at leaving the dying twins, Brennan found himself compelled by a mixture of professional curiosity and deep moral outrage. The patriarch led him up a treacherous mountain path through snow-laden forests that seemed to swallow sound itself. The upper cabin was a fortress of isolation, its windows boarded from the outside, its single door secured with multiple locks. The structure itself was newer than the family home below, built specifically to serve as both nursery and prison for Malachi's selective breeding program. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of confinement. Unwashed bodies, stale food, and the peculiar mustiness that comes from complete isolation from the outside world. She sat in the corner when they entered, and Dr. Brennan's breath caught in his throat. The girl was indeed physically remarkable, but not in the way Malachi had described. Rather than genetic perfection, she embodied the ultimate product of inbreeding's destructive effects. Her beauty was haunting but wrong. Features too sharp, eyes too large for her skull, skin so pale it seemed translucent. "Grandfather," she said, her voice carrying a strange melodic quality that sounded more like an echo than human speech. Her gaze fixed on Dr. Brennan with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You brought a stranger." What struck Brennan most forcefully was her intelligence. Despite 17 years of isolation and indoctrination, something alive and questioning burned behind those oversized eyes. She had indeed been questioning her confinement, as Malachi had reluctantly admitted, and her growing awareness of her situation was evident in every word she spoke. "Tell me about the world below," she asked Dr. Brennan, ignoring her grandfather's sharp look of disapproval. "Are there others like me? Others who choose their own paths?" Malachi's jaw tightened. Sarah speaks out of ignorance. Her purpose is clear, her path predetermined. The bloodline requires... "The bloodline," she interrupted, and Brennan heard decades of suppressed rebellion in those two words, "has given me nothing but this room and your promises of destiny I never chose." The girl's revolt was more than teenage defiance. It was the emergence of human will from beneath layers of conditioning and control. She had begun to understand that her sacred purpose was actually sexual slavery, that her perfect genetics were the result of generational abuse, that her destiny was to produce children for a grandfather who saw her as livestock rather than family. Malachi's confidence wavered as he watched his perfect creation asserting independence. The systematic breeding program that had produced Sarah had also inadvertently created someone intelligent enough to recognize her own imprisonment and strong enough to resist it. Sarah's defiance sent tremors through the foundation of everything Malachi Donnelly had built over decades of genetic manipulation. As Dr. Brennan watched, the girl who had been raised as the culmination of selective breeding began to systematically dismantle her grandfather's authority with words sharp as surgical instruments. "I have counted every day in this room," she said, rising from her corner with fluid grace that belied years of confinement. 6,205 days since I could first remember. I have memorized every board in these walls, every crack in the ceiling, and I have thought, grandfather, despite your best efforts to prevent it, I have thought." Malachi's face hardened. "Thinking leads to corruption. You were kept pure, protected from the contamination of weak minds and foreign ideas. Your purpose is greater than individe. Dual will." Sarah laughed, and the sound was like crystal breaking. "My purpose? You mean to breed me like one of your mountain goats until my body gives out or I die in childbirth like the others?" "I've heard their screams echoing up from below, grandfather. I've counted how often they stopped." Dr. Brennan realized that despite her physical isolation, Sarah had been acutely aware of the suffering in the lower cabin. Her superhuman hearing, perhaps a result of the genetic concentration Malachi had achieved, had made her witness to every failed birth, every infant's death cry, every moment of agony endured by the women trapped in the breeding program. "The perfect child you created," she continued, moving closer to the old man with predatory confidence, "is perfect enough to see through your lies. You didn't breed out weakness, grandfather, you bred out humanity. And what remains is something you cannot control." The confrontation revealed something Malachi hadn't anticipated in his decades of genetic planning. Intelligence concentrated to the same degree as physical traits could produce a mind capable of resistance rather than submission. His perfect child had inherited not just enhanced physical characteristics, but also the mental acuity to understand her situation and the emotional strength to reject it. "You will obey," Malachi said, but uncertainty crept into his voice for the first time. "The bloodline demands." "The bloodline ends with me," Sarah declared with finality that made both men freeze. "I will bear no children for your experiments. I will produce no more subjects for your torture. Whatever genetic perfection you think you've achieved dies in this room." Dr. Brennan watched the patriarch's carefully constructed world begin to crumble as his ultimate creation turned against him. The girl who was supposed to perpetuate his legacy had become its destro, using the very intelligence he had bred into her to recognize the horror of her situation. The rebellion that would shatter 4 generations of systematic abuse had begun. As Sarah's defiance grew bolder, Dr. Brennan began to understand the true cost of the Donnelly family's pursuit of genetic perfection. The girl's rebellion wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Her body, refined through generations of selective breeding, was beginning to break down under the weight of its own concentrated genetics. "Look at me closely, Doctor," Sarah said, stepping into the pale light filtering through the cabin's barricaded windows. "Look at what perfection actually means." In the harsh morning light, the flaws became visible. Her translucent skin revealed networks of veins that pulsed with an irregular rhythm. Her joints moved with an unnatural flexibility that spoke of connective tissue disorders. Her breathing, while normally silent, occasionally caught on what sounded like fluid in her lungs. "She is the culmination of our work," Malachi insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Minor adjustments in future generations will correct these small imperfections." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Small imperfections? Grandfather, I am dying. Your concentrated bloodline has concentrated death itself. I suffer seizures you know nothing about. My heart skips beats in patterns that would terrify your doctor friend. My bones ache as though they're dissolving from within." Dr. Brennan's medical training allowed him to see what the patriarch's obsession had blinded him to. Sarah exhibited classic symptoms of severe inbreeding depression, genetic disorders that manifested when recessive traits became dominant through repeated consanguineous reproduction. Her perfection was actually a carefully hidden collection of potentially fatal conditions. "The headache started when I was 12, she continued, addressing Brennan directly. "Migraines so severe I would lose consciousness for hours. The bleeding began at 14, internal hemorrhaging that left me weak for weeks. And the episodes. Moments when my mind fractures and I see things that aren't there, hear voices of children who were never allowed to live." These symptoms painted a picture of neurological deterioration, circulatory problems, and psychiatric manifestations that were likely the result of homozygous expression of deleterious alleles, the very genetic defects that Malachi had thought he was breeding out of the family line. "Your perfect child," Brennan told the patriarch, "is suffering from the accumulated genetic load of 4 generations of inbreeding. What you call perfection is actually a collection of rare genetic disorders that would kill her within a few years, even under the best medical care." Malachi's face went white as the implications sank in. His life's work, his genetic masterpiece, was actually a demonstration of everything wrong with his approach to human breeding. The concentrated bloodline he had created wasn't pure, it was poisoned by its own genetic limitations. Sarah smiled with grim satisfaction. "Your legacy dies with me, grandfather, and I intend to make sure it dies slowly enough for you to watch." While Sarah's rebellion unfolded in the mountain cabin, Dr. Brennan discovered that the Society for Improvement's reach extended far beyond what he had initially imagined. Among Malachi's correspondence were recent letters indicating active breeding programs in at least 12 states and territories, each following variations of the Donnelly model, but adapted to different ethnic bloodlines and geographic conditions. The most disturbing letter came from a Dr. Heinrich Brenner in Ohio, who described his family's systematic breeding program designed to concentrate Germanic purity through controlled reproductive relationships. His clinical notes detailed the production of what he called specimen children, offspring evaluated and categorized according to their breeding potential, with those deemed inferior quietly eliminated. A second letter from the Kowalski family in Pennsylvania discussed their parallel efforts to preserve Polish genetic heritage. Their approach was even more systematic than the Donnellys, involving detailed medical examinations, fertility testing, and arranged breeding schedules that treated human reproduction like livestock management. Perhaps most chilling was correspondence from Ireland itself, suggesting that the Society's network stretched back to the Old Country. A certain Father O'Sullivan wrote about preserving the Celtic essence through careful marriage arrangements within isolated communities, using religious authority to enforce breeding protocols disguised as moral guidance. Each family contributes unique insights, Malachi explained, his confidence returning as he focused on the broader movement rather than Sarah's rebellion. The Germans' perfect skeletal structure, the Polish concentrate cardiovascular efficiency, the Irish maintain neurological acuity. When the time comes, we will crossbreed our finest specimens to create a master race. Dr. Brennan realized he was looking at an organized effort to manipulate human evolution on a continental scale. The isolated frontier communities that defined American expansion were providing perfect cover for genetic experimentation that would have been impossible in more populated areas. Families like the Donnellys served as living laboratories, producing data that was shared across the network to refine breeding techniques and eliminate what the society considered genetic inferiors. The letters referenced planned gatherings where families would exchange breeding stock, share medical observations, and coordinate future reproductive strategies. These meetings were disguised as religious revivals or community celebrations, allowing the society to operate openly while hiding their true purpose from outsiders. The next conclave is scheduled for spring, Malachi continued, in Colorado territory. Representatives from all active breeding programs will attend. Your presence would be valuable, Doctor. A medical professional's observations could advance our work significantly. The casual invitation to join their monstrous project revealed how normalized the society's activities had become within their network. They genuinely believed they were conducting important scientific work, improving humanity through selective breeding while eliminating genetic weakness from the American population. Sarah listened to this discussion with growing horror, finally understanding that her suffering was part of a much larger, systematic dehumanization of countless individuals across the country. Sarah's growing awareness of the society's broader scope filled her with a rage that transcended her personal imprisonment. As Malachi continued describing the network's activities, she began to understand that her suffering was multiplied across dozens of communities, affecting hundreds of children who had been reduced to breeding stock in a massive human trafficking operation disguised as genetic research. "Tell me about the others," she demanded, her voice carrying new authority. "The children in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, what happens to the ones who don't meet your standards?" Malachi's hesitation revealed more than his words could hide. The letters he had shared contained only success stories and scientific observations, but Sarah's questions forced him to acknowledge the human cost of the society's work. For every perfect specimen like herself, dozens of children had been eliminated, abandoned, or sold to other families within the network. Dr. Brennan studied the correspondence more carefully, reading between the lines of clinical language to understand the true scope of the horror. References to specimen exchange clearly indicated human trafficking. Discussions of inferior elimination meant systematic infanticide. Terms like breeding optimization described the forced sexual exploitation of girls as young as 12 or 13. The Brenner family in Ohio has produced 17 successful specimens over the past decade, Malachi admitted when pressed. Their elimination rate is approximately 60%, quite efficient considering the complex genetic challenges they face. The casual discussion of a 60% infant mortality rate revealed the systematic nature of the society's killing. These weren't isolated family tragedies, but deliberate extermination programs designed to remove genetic inferiors from breeding populations. The network was conducting genocide in miniature, hidden within America's frontier communities. Sarah's intelligence, concentrated through generations of selective breeding, allowed her to grasp the mathematical horror more clearly than anyone else in the room. "Hundreds of children," she whispered. "You're murdering hundreds of children every year across your network, all to produce a few dozen specimens you consider acceptable for breeding." The girl's analysis was brutally accurate. Dr. Brennan calculated that if each family maintained similar elimination rates, the society was responsible for the deaths of several hundred infants and children annually. The scope of systematic murder hidden within America's expanding frontier was staggering. "They die so that perfection might live," Malachi said, attempting to justify the slaughter. "Each loss serves the greater purpose of human improvement." Sarah stood silent for a long moment, processing the full implications of her heritage. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations of murdered children. "I am not perfection, grandfather. I am the living monument to your crimes, and I will not allow one more child to die for your twisted vision of purity." The rebellion had become something larger than personal defiance. It was now a war against organized genetic terrorism. As Dr. Brennan systematically examined the Society's correspondence and records, he began to build a case that revealed the true scope of their operations. What had initially appeared to be one family's descent into madness was actually a coordinated network of genetic terrorists operating across the American frontier, using isolation and religious authority to hide systematic murder and human trafficking. The medical records Maliki had maintained were particularly damning. Detailed autopsy notes described the deliberate killing of infants with minor birth defects. Children who might have lived normal lives with proper care were instead categorized as genetic failures and eliminated through suffocation, poisoning, or simple neglect. The clinical language couldn't disguise the premeditated nature of these murders. Financial records revealed another layer of the horror. The Society operated as a business network, with families paying fees to exchange breeding stock and purchasing genetic assessments from qualified medical professionals who had been corrupted by the movement's ideology. Children were literally bought and sold based on their perceived breeding potential, with prices determined by factors like bone structure, eye color, and family genetic history. Most disturbing were the breeding schedules that mapped out reproductive relationships years in advance. Girls as young as 8 years old were already assigned future breeding partners based on genetic compatibility assessments. Their entire lives were planned around maximizing reproductive output while maintaining the bloodline purity that obsessed the Society's leadership. "These aren't family records," Dr. Brennan told Sarah as he studied the documents. "These are criminal enterprise ledgers. Your grandfather isn't just a patriarch, he's a human trafficker operating on a massive scale." Sarah absorbed this information with the concentrated intelligence her breeding had given her. "How many active sites?" she asked, studying the correspondence network. Dr. Brennan counted carefully. At least 12 confirmed locations across 8 states and territories. Based on the correspondence patterns, probably twice that number in smaller operations. We're looking at several thousand people involved, either as victims or perpetrators. The scope was staggering. The Society for Improvement had essentially created a shadow economy based on human breeding, hidden within America's frontier communities and protected by isolation, religious authority, and systematic intimidation of potential witnesses. Local law enforcement was either complicit, incompetent, or simply unaware of the crimes being committed in their jurisdictions. Maliki watched the analysis with growing unease. His perfect system was being dissected like a corpse, its criminal nature exposed through clinical examination of his own meticulous records. The documentation he had maintained as proof of his scientific achievement was becoming evidence of his guilt in multiple felonies. "This information dies here," he said quietly, his voice carrying implicit threat. "The work is too important to be destroyed by outsiders who lack vision." But Sarah's smile suggested that the patriarch's threats no longer carried the power they once had. Sarah's rebellion crystallized into concrete action as she began planning not just her own escape, but the systematic destruction of her grandfather's genetic empire. Her years of forced isolation had given her something Maliki hadn't anticipated: time to observe, analyze, and prepare for this moment when opportunity would finally present itself. "The spring conclave," she told Dr. Brennan quietly while Maliki slept in his chair. "Every major family sends representatives to Colorado Territory. That's when the network is most vulnerable, when they're all gathered in one place sharing their records and specimens." Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Society's own meeting structure could be turned against them. Representatives would bring breeding records, financial documents, and physical evidence of their operations. Local law enforcement could be alerted in advance, federal marshals could be positioned, and the entire network could be exposed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. But first, they needed to escape the mountain stronghold that had served as Sarah's prison for 17 years. The girl's knowledge of the terrain, gained through years of staring out barricaded windows and listening to sounds from the valley below, gave her advantages that Maliki couldn't have imagined when he designed her confinement. "The old mine shaft behind the upper cabin connects to the valley system," she explained, sketching a rough map in the dust on the floor. "I've been watching the patterns of wildlife movement, tracking seasonal changes. There's a path that would bring us down near the main settlement without crossing any of the lookout points Grandfather has established. Dr. Brennan marveled at the girl's intelligence and strategic thinking. Despite 17 years of attempted indoctrination, her mind had remained not just independent but actively rebellious, gathering intelligence and preparing for eventual resistance. The genetic concentration that had made her physically frail had also made her intellectually formidable. "What about the others in the lower cabin?" Brennan asked. "Your family members who are trapped in the breeding program?" Sarah's expression hardened. "They're victims, but they're also accomplices. Patrick, Moira, the children, they all participate in the system because they're too afraid or too conditioned to resist. Some of them can be saved, but others..." She trailed off, the weight of moral complexity evident in her voice. The escape would have to be timed carefully. Malachi's age made him vulnerable during his increasingly frequent periods of exhaustion, but the mountain terrain was dangerous, especially for someone in Sarah's deteriorating physical condition. They would have one opportunity, and failure would likely result in both their deaths. As dawn approached and the patriarch began to stir, Sarah met Dr. Brennan's eyes with determination that had been forged through years of suffering. "Tonight," she whispered. "We end this tonight." The escape began in the deep hours before dawn, when the Montana mountain cold bit deepest and Malachi's sleep was heaviest. Sarah moved through the darkness with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent years planning this moment, gathering supplies she had hidden over months of careful preparation. Her grandfather's paranoid security measures designed to keep her imprisoned also served to conceal their departure from any outside observers. Dr. Brennan followed her through the mine shaft that served as their escape route, marveling at her knowledge of passages that seemed to exist in complete darkness. The girl had somehow memorized the underground network through sound and air currents alone, navigating with confidence that came from desperate necessity rather than casual exploration. "The breeding records," she whispered as they moved through narrow tunnels carved by long-dead miners. "We need the complete archives from the lower cabin before we can expose the network. Without documentation, it becomes our word against an entire community that profits from silence." The descent through underground passages brought them to a natural cave system that opened near the family homestead. Through cracks in the rock, they could see the familiar cabin where Dr. Brennan had first encountered the Donnelly family's horrors. The building now looked different to him, not a home but a factory designed for systematic human breeding and elimination. Sarah's deteriorating physical condition became more apparent as they traveled. Her breathing grew labored, her movements less certain. The genetic defects that Malachi had tried to breed away had actually been concentrated in her bloodline, creating a body that was simultaneously exceptional and fragile. Every step down the mountain took visible toll on her failing health. "I won't live long enough to see them prosecuted," she admitted as they paused to rest near the cave opening. "The seizures are getting worse, and the internal bleeding." She touched her side where dark stains were beginning to show through her clothing. "But I can live long enough to make sure they're stopped." The girl's acceptance of her own mortality was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had spent her entire life as a victim of systematic abuse, yet she was willing to sacrifice what little time remained to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Her rebellion had transcended personal liberation and become a mission of justice. As they approached the lower cabin, voices drifted through the thin mountain air. The family was awake, discussing the conjoined twins who had died during the night. Patrick's voice carried grief that sounded genuine, but also resignation that spoke of countless similar losses over the years. Sarah's jaw tightened as she heard her family casually discussing another failed experiment. "They mourn the deaths but never question the killing," she whispered. "That ends now." Sarah's return to the family homestead after 17 years of mountain isolation created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch across generations of guilt and complicity. The relatives gathered in the main cabin, Patrick, Moira, and the surviving children, stared at her with expressions that mixed recognition, fear, and something that might have been shame. "Hello, Father," Sarah said to Patrick, her voice carrying years of concentrated anger. The word father hung in the air with deliberate ambiguity. Patrick was simultaneously her father, uncle, and genetic contributor through the tangled relationships that defined the Donnelly bloodline. Moira backed against the wall, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly where the next experimental pregnancy was already beginning to show. The woman's eyes darted between Sarah and the door, calculating escape routes with the desperate efficiency of someone who had spent years as breeding stock. "The perfect child has come home," Patrick whispered, but his voice carried no joy. Sarah's presence meant that Malachi's control system was breaking down, that the carefully maintained isolation between the breeding population and the perfected specimen had been breached. Dr. Brennan watched the family dynamics with clinical fascination and moral horror. These people were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, trapped in a system that had normalized child murder and sexual exploitation to such a degree that they could no longer recognize their own participation in systematic genocide. "Where are grandfather's records?" Sarah demanded, moving through the cabin with authority that came from genetic superiority and intellectual dominance. "The breeding charts, the correspondence with other families, the financial documents, everything." The children, her siblings, cousins, and possibly her own offspring through relationships too complex to untangle, pressed themselves into corners like frightened animals. Their physical deformities spoke of generations of genetic concentration, but their behavioral responses revealed psychological damage that might be even more extensive than their bodily harm. Patrick attempted to assert traditional patriarchal authority. "You belong on the mountain with grandfather. This is not your place." "This is exactly my place," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through decades of conditioning. "I was bred to be perfect, to be intelligent, to be superior. Well, I'm intelligent enough to recognize genocide when I see it, and superior enough to stop it." She began systematically searching the cabin, pulling documents from hiding places that her concentrated genetics allowed her to identify through patterns invisible to normal perception. Letters, breeding charts, financial records and photographs spilled across the rough wooden table like evidence at a criminal trial. "Dr. Brennan is going to help me carry these to the authorities," she announced. "Every family in the network, every child who died, every girl who was trafficked, all of it documented and preserved." The family's silence spoke volumes about their complicity in crimes they had never acknowledged as crimes. As Sarah compiled the evidence that would expose the Society for Improvement, she uncovered a document that revealed the most horrifying truth of all. She was not actually the perfect child Malachi had claimed her to be. Hidden beneath layers of false genealogical records was her real genetic heritage, a revelation that would shatter the patriarch's delusions of successful selective breeding. "Look at this," she said to Dr. Brennan, holding up a birth certificate that had been altered multiple times. "My real parentage before grandfather rewrote the records to match his fantasy." The document revealed that Sarah was not the product of careful genetic selection, but rather the survivor of a much darker reality. She had been one of twins born to a woman who had died in childbirth, and her sister had been eliminated not for genetic imperfection, but because Malachi could only control one child effectively in his mountain isolation. Her perfect genetics were actually the random result of recessive gene combinations that had produced enhanced intelligence and physical capabilities despite, not because of, the systematic inbreeding. She had won a genetic lottery while surrounded by losers, and Malachi had retroactively constructed a breeding narrative to explain her exceptional traits. "I'm not perfect," Sarah realized, her voice mixing relief with horror. "I'm just lucky. All those children who died, all the girls who were trafficked and bred like livestock, none of it was necessary. Grandfather's entire system was based on a lie he told himself to justify murder." Dr. Brennan studied the authentic records with growing understanding. The genetic principles Malachi claimed to follow were pseudoscientific nonsense, a crude misunderstanding of heredity that had been used to rationalize systematic abuse. The superior bloodline he had spent decades cultivating was actually deteriorating with each generation, producing more genetic disorders and intellectual disabilities than ever before. The Society's correspondence revealed the same pattern across their network. Families were killing healthy children based on arbitrary physical criteria while preserving bloodlines that were becoming increasingly unstable. Their master race project was actually producing exactly the opposite result: genetic deterioration disguised as improvement through selective record-keeping and systematic dishonesty. "He knew," Sarah said quietly, studying her grandfather's private notes. Some part of him always knew the breeding program was failing, but he kept killing children anyway because stopping would have meant admitting that everything he built was worthless. The final revelation destroyed any remaining sympathy for the patriarch's stated goals. This wasn't misguided science. It was sadistic murder justified by intellectual vanity and protected by systematic intimidation. The Society for Improvement was revealed as nothing more than organized child abuse operating on a massive scale. Sarah's rebellion had evolved from personal liberation to become something larger: the complete destruction of a criminal network built on lies, sustained by violence, and hidden by America's frontier isolation. Malachi Donnelly's return from the mountain stronghold brought with him the cold fury of a man whose life's work faced complete annihilation. The patriarch had awakened to find his perfect child missing, along with the doctor who had witnessed his genetic empire's darkest secrets. His descent to the family homestead was less a journey than a reckoning, each step down the mountain path marking another degree of his descent into desperate rage. He entered the cabin like an avatar of patriarchal authority challenged, his pale eyes immediately cataloguing everything that had changed in his absence. The scattered documents, the frightened expressions of his family members, and Sarah's defiant posture told him everything he needed to know about the rebellion that threatened to destroy 4 generations of systematic control. "Return to the mountain," he commanded Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that had shaped her entire existence. "This contamination ends now." But Sarah had passed beyond the reach of his threats. Her 17 years of imprisonment had finally taught her the difference between power and weakness, and she could see what everyone else had always been too frightened to acknowledge. Malachi was an old man whose control depended entirely on others' willingness to submit to his delusions. "I know what I really am," she replied, holding up the authentic birth records that revealed her true genetic heritage. "I know what you really are, and I know what all of this really means." The documents scattered across the table told the story of the patriarch's lies with clinical precision. Birth certificates that had been altered, genealogical charts that had been fabricated, breeding records that had been manipulated to hide systematic failure behind claims of genetic improvement. Malachi's reaction revealed just how much of it, his own mythology, he had begun to believe. Faced with evidence of his deception, he didn't deny the lies. He became angry that they had been discovered. His authority had always depended on controlling information, and Sarah's intelligence had finally given her the tools to penetrate his constructed reality. "You understand nothing," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "The work requires sacrifices that weak minds cannot comprehend. Every child who died served the greater purpose of human advancement." Dr. Brennan stepped forward, his medical training giving him authority that transcended the patriarch's domestic tyranny. "There is no greater purpose. There never was. You've been murdering children to feed your own delusions of grandeur." The confrontation had moved beyond family dynamics into something larger, a battle between truth and systematic self-deception, between individual conscience and institutional evil, between the courage to resist and the comfort of compliance with organized horror. News of the Donnelly family's exposure spread through the Society for Improvement's network like wildfire, triggering a cascade of panic as families across the frontier realized their crimes might soon face the scrutiny of federal law enforcement. Dr. Brennan's medical credentials gave his testimony credibility that simple witness accounts could never achieve, while Sarah's detailed knowledge of the network's operations provided investigators with a roadmap to uncovering similar operations across multiple states and territories. The first arrests came in Ohio, where Dr. Heinrich Brenner's systematic breeding program had left a paper trail that federal marshals could follow with devastating efficiency. His meticulous medical records, once proof of his scientific dedication, became evidence of premeditated murder on a massive scale. The Germanic purity he had claimed to perfect through selective breeding was revealed as systematic infanticide disguised as genetic research. In Pennsylvania, the Kowalski family's operation collapsed when local authorities discovered their specimen exchange records. Children who had been reported as dying of natural causes were found to have been deliberately killed or sold to other families within the network. The Polish genetic heritage they claimed to preserve had actually been systematically destroyed through generations of abuse and exploitation. The Colorado Territory Gathering, planned as the Society's grandest celebration of genetic improvement, became instead a coordinated law enforcement operation that netted dozens of participants from across the network. Families who had traveled hundreds of miles to share breeding techniques and exchange human cargo found themselves facing federal charges for human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic child abuse. Religious authorities who had provided ideological cover for the network's activities found their own positions compromised as investigators uncovered the true nature of their marriage guidance and family planning services. Father O'Sullivan's correspondence from Ireland revealed an international dimension to the trafficking operation that stretched back to the Old Country. The financial records proved most damaging of all. Bank drafts, letters of credit, and payment schedules revealed that the society had operated as a business enterprise, with children literally bought and sold based on perceived breeding potential. The scope of the commercial operation shocked even experienced federal investigators who had dealt with frontier lawlessness. Sarah's deteriorating health meant she would not live to see all the prosecutions that her rebellion had made possible, but her detailed testimony was recorded and preserved as evidence that would ensure the network's destruction. Her intelligence, concentrated through generations of breeding, had been turned against the very system that created her. As the network crumbled, survivors emerged from communities across the frontier, children who had terrorized into silence by the society's systematic violence. The scope of liberation matched the scope of the original crimes. The trials that followed the Society for Improvement's exposure became landmark cases in the federal prosecution of organized crime on the American frontier. The systematic nature of the network's operations, documented through their own meticulous records, provided prosecutors with evidence that could support charges ranging from murder and human trafficking to mail fraud and conspiracy across state lines. Malachi Donnelly's trial became the centerpiece of the prosecutorial effort. His decades of systematic record-keeping, originally intended to document his genetic achievements, provided federal prosecutors with a detailed confession to hundreds of murders disguised as scientific research. The patriarch's courtroom demeanor, arrogant, unrepentant, still convinced of his genetic superiority, horrified observers and sealed his conviction. The sentences were severe by the standards of frontier justice. Malachi received life imprisonment in federal prison, where his age and frailty made survival unlikely. Other network leaders received terms ranging from 20 years to execution, depending on the number of murders that could be proven against them and their level of leadership within the organization. But the most significant consequence was not legal, but social. The society's exposure shattered the isolation that had protected systematic abuse within frontier communities. Federal oversight of remote settlements increased dramatically, and territorial governments implemented new reporting requirements for births, deaths, and family structures that made hidden breeding programs nearly impossible to maintain. Religious authorities found themselves subject to increased scrutiny as investigators realized how extensively the network had used Church authority to legitimize their operations. Seminary training began to include specific instruction about identifying and reporting child abuse, while church hierarchies implemented new oversight mechanisms to prevent future infiltration by criminal enterprises. The medical profession also faced a reckoning. Dr. Brennan's role in exposing the network highlighted how easily medical authority could be corrupted to legitimize systematic abuse. Medical schools began requiring coursework in ethics and professional responsibility, while territorial medical boards implemented new standards for licensing and oversight. Sarah's death, which came just weeks before the major trials began, was recorded as resulting from complications of severe inbreeding depression. Her autopsy revealed the extensive genetic damage that Malachi's breeding program had actually produced: organ defects, circulatory disorders, and neurological abnormalities that had been hidden by her exceptional intelligence and determination. The girl who had been presented as proof of genetic perfection became instead a medical case study in the dangers of systematic inbreeding. Her preserved testimony, however, ensured that her sacrifice would prevent countless others from suffering similar exploitation. The frontier communities that had harbored the society's operations struggled with the aftermath of exposure. Property values collapsed in areas associated with the network, and surviving community members faced social stigma that lasted for generations. The systematic silence that had enabled the crimes was replaced by a new willingness to report suspicious activity to federal authorities. In the aftermath of the society's collapse, the surviving victims faced challenges that extended far beyond their physical and psychological trauma. Children who had been raised within the breeding programs struggled to adapt to normal social relationships, having spent their entire lives in environments where human worth was measured solely by genetic utility and reproductive potential. Many of the rescued children required extensive medical care for conditions that had been ignored or deliberately caused by their captors. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and genetic disorders complicated their integration into foster families or charitable institutions. The frontier territories lacked sufficient medical infrastructure to address the specialized needs of children who had been systematically abused for genetic experimentation. Women who had been trafficked for breeding purposes faced particular difficulties in rebuilding their lives. Many had been separated from their families as children and had no knowledge of their original identities or home communities. Their reproductive health had been damaged by forced pregnancies and crude medical procedures, leaving many unable to bear children normally, even if they chose to do so. The psychological trauma proved even more challenging to address than the physical consequences. Survivors exhibited complex patterns of learned helplessness, having been conditioned from birth to accept authority without question and to view their own suffering as serving a greater purpose. Simple decisions about food, clothing, or daily activities could trigger severe anxiety in people who had never been allowed personal choice. Religious faith became a complicated issue for many survivors. The society had extensively used religious language and authority to justify their operations, creating lasting associations between spiritual belief and systematic abuse. Some survivors rejected all religious expression, while others became obsessively devout in attempts to reclaim spiritual concepts from their abusers. Educational challenges were enormous. Most rescued children had received no formal schooling, having been taught only what their captors deemed necessary for their reproductive roles. Basic literacy and numeracy had to be developed from scratch in adolescents and adults who possessed the intellectual capacity to learn but lacked any educational foundation. Community integration proved nearly impossible in many cases. Frontier settlements were small, insular places where everyone's business was known to everyone else. Survivors of the breeding programs carried social stigma that marked them as different, damaged, and potentially dangerous to normal community life. Some survivors formed their own communities, banding together for mutual support and protection. These settlements became refuges where people could heal without judgment and develop new social structures based on choice rather than genetic destiny. The bonds formed through shared trauma often proved stronger than traditional family relationships. The federal government's response was limited by the era's understanding of trauma and rehabilitation. Most official assistance focused on immediate physical needs, food, shelter, basic medical care, while leaving survivors to address their psychological and social needs through whatever informal support networks they could develop. The Society for Improvement's exposure sent shockwaves through American society that extended far beyond the immediate legal prosecutions and victim rehabilitation efforts. The systematic nature of the crimes, hidden within communities that represented the frontier spirit of American expansion, forced a national reckoning with the dark possibilities that lay beneath the mythology of pioneer self-reliance. Newspaper coverage of the trials brought the breeding program's horrors to national attention, sparking debates about federal oversight of remote communities and the proper limits of family authority. Editorial writers struggled to comprehend how American communities could harbor operations that resembled nothing so much as commercial. Livestock breeding applied to human beings. The scientific establishment faced particular scrutiny as investigators revealed how extensively the society had misappropriated legitimate genetic research to justify their operations. Universities began requiring ethical oversight for any research involving human subjects, while medical journals implemented new standards for evaluating and publishing genetic studies. International reaction was particularly harsh, with European observers citing the society's operations as evidence of American moral corruption and frontier lawlessness. The systematic breeding programs were compared to the worst excesses of ancient slavery, while the network's use of pseudo-scientific language to justify murder drew parallels to medieval superstition disguised as rational inquiry. Religious denominations that had inadvertently provided cover for the society's operations initiated extensive internal reviews to identify and eliminate similar vulnerabilities. Seminary training began emphasizing the identification of abusive authority structures, while church governance structures were modified to prevent individual leaders from operating without oversight. The legal precedents established by the society prosecutions influenced criminal law development for decades afterward. Federal jurisdiction over crimes that crossed state boundaries was strengthened, while definitions of human trafficking were expanded to include domestic operations that had previously been treated as family matters beyond legal intervention. Perhaps most significantly, the exposure changed how American society understood the relationship between isolation and abuse. The frontier mythology that had celebrated self-reliant communities operating beyond governmental oversight was tempered by recognition that such isolation could hide systematic crimes that would be impossible in more connected communities. Educational initiatives emerged to help community leaders recognize signs of organized abuse and understand their obligations to report suspicious activities to federal authorities. The silence that had enabled the society's crimes was systematically challenged through new communication networks and reporting requirements. The breeding program's exposure also influenced emerging discussions about eugenics and racial purity that were beginning to gain political traction in various American communities. The society's crimes provided concrete evidence of how genetic theories could be perverted to justify systematic murder and exploitation, serving as a cautionary example for future policy debates. The Donnelly name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked patriarchal authority and genetic extremism, ensuring that the family's crimes would serve as a lasting warning about the potential for systematic evil to hide behind respectable facades. Even as the major prosecutions concluded, federal investigators continued uncovering evidence of the Society for Improvement's broader operations. The network's correspondents had referenced associated families and sympathetic communities across the frontier, suggesting that the exposed operations represented only a portion of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been developing for decades. New evidence emerged from unexpected sources as survivors gained confidence to report their experiences. Adults who had escaped from breeding programs years earlier came forward with information about operations in territories that investigators had not previously suspected. Their testimonies revealed that the society's influence had extended into communities that appeared completely normal to outside observers. The investigation's scope expanded to include financial institutions that had facilitated the network's operations. Banks in major cities had processed transfers of funds disguised as legitimate business transactions, but actually representing payments for trafficked children and breeding services. Some financial institutions faced prosecution for their role in enabling organized crime, while others cooperated with authorities to trace money flows that revealed previously unknown criminal connections. International law enforcement agencies became involved as investigators discovered that the Society's operations extended beyond American borders. The correspondence with Father O'Sullivan in Ireland had referenced similar operations in other countries, suggesting a transatlantic network that trafficked children and breeding stock between continents. Canadian authorities initiated their own investigations after discovering that several families had crossed the border to escape American law enforcement, continuing their operations in isolated communities where federal oversight was even more limited. The international dimension of the crimes complicated prosecutions, but also provided opportunities for unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Military authorities conducted reviews of their own personnel after discovering that some society members had connections to frontier military posts. The network had apparently used military connections to facilitate transportation of trafficked children and to gain advance warning of law enforcement activities in remote areas. Congressional hearings examined how federal agencies had failed to detect such extensive criminal operations despite having jurisdiction over territorial governance. The hearings revealed systematic gaps in federal oversight of frontier communities and led to legislation strengthening requirements for territorial administration and law enforcement. The Catholic Church initiated its own internal investigation after discovering that multiple priests had been involved with the society's operations. The Church's review revealed how extensively criminal organizations could infiltrate religious institutions and use spiritual authority to legitimize systematic abuse. Academic researchers began studying the society's operations as a case study in organizational crime and community complicity. Their analysis revealed patterns of institutional failure that extended beyond law enforcement to include medical, educational, and religious authorities who had either actively participated in the crimes or failed to recognize and report obvious signs of systematic abuse. The ongoing investigations ensured that the society's exposure would have lasting consequences for American criminal justice and social policy. Despite the comprehensive exposure of the Society for Improvement's crimes and the extensive legal, social, and institutional reforms that followed, disturbing evidence emerged in subsequent decades that similar operations had continued to develop in America's remote communities. The systematic nature of the Society's crimes, rather than serving as a definitive deterrent, appeared to have provided a blueprint for other criminal organizations seeking to exploit frontier isolation and community silence. By the early 1900s, federal investigators had identified at least 6 separate networks operating with methodologies that closely resembled the Society's breeding programs. These new operations had learned from their predecessors' mistakes, maintaining better operational security and avoiding the extensive record-keeping that had ultimately enabled the Society's prosecution. The new networks operated with greater geographic dispersion, avoiding the concentration of activities that had made the Society vulnerable to coordinated law enforcement action. Instead of maintaining large family compounds, the evolved operations distributed their activities across multiple states and territories, making detection and prosecution significantly more challenging. Religious infiltration remained a consistent element, with criminal organizations continuing to use spiritual authority to legitimize systematic abuse and maintain community silence. Despite increased seminary training and church oversight, new cases continued to emerge of clergy members who had been corrupted or intimidated into supporting organized breeding programs. The financial infrastructure supporting these operations also evolved to avoid the banking relationships that had helped expose the Society. New networks relied more heavily on cash transactions and informal financial networks that were much more difficult for investigators to trace and prosecute. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that some of the Society's former members had survived their prosecutions and continued their activities in new locations under assumed identities. The systematic nature of their previous operations had given them expertise in human trafficking and genetic manipulation that they continued to exploit despite their criminal convictions. Educational efforts to help communities recognize and report signs of organized abuse had achieved limited success in frontier areas where isolation and self-reliance remained cultural imperatives. Many communities continued to view federal intervention with suspicion, preferring to handle problems through informal local mechanisms that criminal organizations could more easily manipulate or intimidate. The legal precedents established by the Society prosecutions had strengthened federal law enforcement capabilities, but the sheer geographic scope of American frontier settlement made comprehensive oversight practically impossible. Criminal organizations could still establish operations in remote areas where federal presence was minimal, and community silence could be maintained through intimidation or complicity. Most troubling of all, some observers noted that the society's pseudo-scientific ideology had not died with the network's exposure. Eugenics theories and racial purity movements were gaining political stability in various American communities, creating intellectual environments where similar criminal operations could potentially gain ideological support and social legitimacy. The Donnelly family's crimes had been exposed and punished, but the conditions that had enabled their systematic horror remained largely unchanged. As we close this dark chapter of American history, the question that haunts every corner of this tale remains unanswered. How many other families, in how many other remote valleys, continue to practice the same systematic horror that defined the Donnelly bloodline? The Society for Improvement may have been exposed and prosecuted, but the isolation that enabled their crimes, the silence that protected their operations, and the twisted ideologies that justified their actions persist in communities across our nation. Sarah Donnelly died believing that her sacrifice had ended the genetic nightmare that consumed her family, but her intelligence, concentrated through generations of selective breeding, may have been too optimistic. The federal prosecutions that followed her revelations were comprehensive but not complete. The network's correspondence referenced operations that were never uncovered, families that were never identified, children who were never rescued. Dr. Theodore Brennan's medical testimony helped convict dozens of individuals for their roles in systematic murder and human trafficking, but his case files contain references to associated physicians and sympathetic medical professionals who were never apprehended. The corruption of medical authority that legitimized the society's crimes was more extensive than the prosecutions revealed. In the years since these events, reports continue to surface of isolated communities where children disappear without explanation, where genetic disorders cluster in patterns that suggest systematic inbreeding, where patriarchal authority operates without external oversight or challenge. Federal investigators lack the resources to pursue every suspicious report, and frontier communities retain their traditional resistance to outside intervention. The most disturbing legacy of the Donnelly family's crimes may be their demonstration that systematic evil can operate successfully within American communities for generations without detection or interference. The breeding programs that killed hundreds of children and trafficked countless others were hidden not by sophisticated criminal techniques, but by simple isolation and community complicity. Modern readers must confront an uncomfortable truth. The conditions that enabled the Society for Improvement's operations have not fundamentally changed. Remote communities still exist where federal oversight is minimal, where local authorities can be corrupted or intimidated, where systematic abuse can hide behind respectable facades of family values and religious authority. The Donnelly genetic mystery was solved through Sarah's rebellion and Dr. Brennan's courage, but the social and institutional failures that allowed such horrors to flourish remain largely unaddressed. The silence that protected systematic murder for generations is broken only when individuals choose to speak, to resist, to expose the comfortable lies that enable organized evil. If you lived in a community where such crimes were taking place, would you have the courage to investigate, to report, to resist? Or would you join the generations of neighbors who chose silence over justice, comfort over truth, complicity over courage? The Donnelly family's genetic mystery is solved, but the moral mystery of human complicity remains as urgent today as it was in that remote Montana valley in 1878.